Okay. Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening. Now, normally I'm posting on the main channel, the Sports Boffin channel, but I haven't done a video for quite some time on the History Boffin, which is where we discuss everything from politics, history, current affairs, film reviews, video game reviews, and just general stuff that's happening in the everyday world. So some big things have happened since I last did a live stream on the History Boffin channel on this channel. Obviously, a lot of COVID restrictions around the world. Obviously, the new variant, Omicron, coming along. A lot of politicians under a lot of pressure. Um, and we've had a few natural disasters. Yes, there's been a massive volcanic eruption in Tonga, um, which has caused all sorts of devastation, caused a tsunami, one of the loudest noises of the last 100 years, one of the most powerful explosions in human history, 100 times more powerful than the bomb they dropped on Hiroshima and the bomb they dropped on Nagasaki. So that just shows how much power was. This is predicted. This is what they're looking at. I haven't fully narrowed down how much energy was expended by this volcano in Tonga. So that's obviously happened recently, and there's still ongoing seismic and volcanic activity down in Tonga. Over here in the UK, Boris Johnson's under a lot of pressure to resign following further allegations of rule breaches due to COVID and gatherings and parties that took place down in Downing Street and other government offices. But the Conservative Party is not the only political party under a lot of pressure. The Labour Party is as well, with certain allegations that certain Labour Party members were also having lockdown parties when we, the population, were either forced to work from home, couldn't go to weddings, funerals, christenings, couldn't see relatives or friends, or were having to work under very constrained conditions. Anyway, so there's that. The Witcher 2 has come out just before Christmas. I watched the series 2, really enjoyed The Witcher second series. I felt it was actually better than the first series. I think they had a good solid foundation with the first series. There was a few plot holes and there was a few production things where it wasn't the best production. Well, it wasn't bad, but it got you interested. The second series has blown the first series out the water. In my personal opinion, I think that is a fantastic piece of well, modern television, modern Netflix, just a modern TV series. Brilliant. I'm looking forward to the next five because there's a 7 series contract that has been signed with Netflix by the owner of the rights to the Witcher series. So we're going to see Henry Cavill on our laptop and PC screens quite a bit over the next decade. Filming starts very soon. He's also going to appear in the remake of the Highlander film franchise. So that's going to be very, very interesting how that gets pulled off, and do they completely do it from the original 1986 Highlander film with Christopher Lambert, Sean Connery, and or do they do it similar and fill in some other holes in the Highlander universe? It'll be very interesting to see what they come up with the Highlander reboot. Also in entertainment news, Microsoft is in the process of buying Activision Blizzard. Activision is the company that makes the Total War PC gaming series and the Call of Duty series. With associated publishers. That is big tech news coming out, and that could have implications for Sony and PlayStation, and also implications not only for the gaming market, but also graphic, not only video gaming, but graphic design and technology in general, because it needs approval from the competition watchdog. And Microsoft has fallen afoul of competition watchdogs before, so it'll be interesting to see if they are allowed to fully take full controlling stake of Activision Blizzard. But Activision Blizzard's been facing a lot of criticism in recent years for its final product. There's a lot of lawsuits that Activision Blizzard are facing right now, and it will be interesting to see how everything plays out with the proposed Microsoft takeover of Activision Blizzard. But on the timeline, it won't be fully completed till next year. So it'll be interesting to see what happens and what plays out. Obviously, Activision Blizzard now owns the right to Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, which were originally PlayStation only releases back in the 90s when it was the Naughty Dog Universal Studios, which was eventually absorbed by Activision Blizzard as that group of companies kept growing over the last 20 years. So Naughty Dog and Universal Gaming Studios were once separate. So Some PlayStation fans are fearing that they're going to lose one of their iconic brands and one of their iconic. Well, Crash Bandicoot is a PlayStation icon, much like Gran Turismo is as well. So it will be interesting to see what happens, and we'll be interested to see if the deal is allowed to fully go ahead. So watch this space in regards to obviously the Microsoft acquisition of Activision. But Activision, as I say, has faced a lot of criticism and negative feedback for some of its recent releases. The fans of Total War, which I am one, we haven't been happy with Activision. A lot of them have switched off Activision over the last 6 years. And the Total War, they've made a lot of mistakes in the direction of that games franchise and the direction it's taking. Obviously, they're traditionally historically based strategy games. Bit more fantasies coming with the Warhammer, which is not a bad thing. Because I'm also a massive Warhammer fan as well. Yeah, they've got some of their historical and releases wrong, and they haven't really listened to feedback from gamers really about what we want to see in the gaming series, and they've lost ground to some independent um, game makers when it comes to the role playing and strategy style games, such as the Bannerlord, which is still only on beta release, but is proving to be very, very popular with some of the updates they've done. They've listened to feedback, the makers of Bannerlord, and so therefore Activision being heavily criticised for the amount of microtransactions in games. There's governments around the world are looking at that and wondering if that should be made illegal. A lot of criticism thrown at Activision for some really poor releases in recent times. EA Games as well also has been facing. So a lot of these gaming production companies have been facing a lot of negative press with some really underwhelming releases in unfinished products, riddled with microtransactions, which has annoyed a lot of gamers who just feel like they've been robbed of the experience, not enjoying the final product. And there's a lot of complaints from within the industry of lawsuits, bullying lawsuits, sexual harassment lawsuits, um, various issues with how these companies are run and operated. So obviously, that's something to be aware of, really. The Novak Djokovic situation, I think, is the most interesting thing that I could cover on both channels. I have covered in live stream the issues with Novak Djokovic on the main sports channel, and I'll cover it here because this year there is an Australian federal election, and it's very, very interesting that Scott Morrison's Liberal-led Liberal National government in Australia overruled the state government of Victoria and basically got him deported in the end. And a lot of Australians, both domestically in Australia and overseas, are very frustrated with many things that have happened in the last 2 years. The lateness for Australia to shut down its borders and the poor vaccine rollout nationwide in Australia to begin with have been figures of criticism, targets of criticism of the Australian government. However, Australia has some of the strictest COVID restrictions in the Western world, much like New Zealand as well. Very, very strict entry rules and very, very strict quarantine rules. The problem with Australia is it's a federation of states and territories. So it's actually similar to the UK, but also different to the UK because at no point were borders completely shut between the four nations that make up the UK, whereas in Australia they have actually sometimes completely shut down state and territory borders for lengthy periods. If you go to the state of Victoria, for example, they've had 7 lockdowns, I believe, at last count, full or partial. Whereas some places like Western Australia and the Northern Territory have been pretty relaxed. Other places like the state of Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland have had levels of strictness when it comes to the regulations. There is a lot of Australian nationals and residents trapped overseas who, for whatever reason, can't get vaccinated because they are classed as overseas nationals in the countries they're in. They've had issues with their visas. They've had to ask for visa extensions by the country that is hosting them, and they're not allowed back into Australia because they haven't had a vaccine. So there's a lot of anger towards the Australian government about leaving its Australian nationals and those who have residency permits stuck overseas. A lot of anger aimed at the government because not all countries overseas will give foreign nationals vaccines, depending where you are. So there's a lot of Australians trapped outside of Australia, very frustratingly. There's also been issues with the Australian New Zealand to Tasman corridor. That's been shut down a few times. So the Australian government is under a lot of pressure. Now, the Novak Djokovic situation, he was not the only tennis player to not be vaccinated who was refused entry at some point. Other players who wanted to play in the Australian Open and the support tournaments were also had their visas denied. Now, the Djokovic situation is he's the biggest name out of about 12 players who had various levels of vaccine status and such. And therefore, he's like the best player in the world right now, possibly one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all time, because he's very close, I believe, to breaking the all-time Grand Slam record. It will be interesting, and it does raise a lot of questions between, at a state and federal level in Australia in regards to, what state governments have authority over and what the national federal government has authority over. And there is a lot of negativity being thrown at the Scott Morrison government. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens. But this, I think, was a knee-jerk populist decision to try and keep the public on side and win some brownie points. The way the situation was handled by border officials, the state of Victoria, the Australian federal state itself, and of course the Novak Djokovic and his advisors, and the tournament, and the tournament organisers of the Australian Open was a shambles from all parties. No one comes out of this looking good, and it'll be interesting to see how that impacts basically the Australian government when it comes to election time, because there has been other scandals involving state premiers and state government officials which has led to their resignations, and also Australia's a sports mad nation. Now, I'm a big fan of the NRL, so if you watch the main channel, you'll figure that out pretty quick. Or if you're new to this channel and you haven't watched the other channel, watch it. If you're into sport, you'll figure out that I'm a massive NRL. And I also like the AFL as well. And these sporting leagues have had to go to state and national government for exemptions, rules. They've had to abide by quarantine rules. They've had, various layers of rules they have to stick by in order for them to be able to compete in Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, state of Victoria, Western Australia. And so they've had to obey by the various states and territories that they compete in. And each state and territory, as I say, has some regulations. Now, Novak Djokovic getting deported may have massive consequences for the AFL, the NRL, and then motorsport like MotoGP, World Superbikes, the V8 Supercars, World Rally Championship, because there's Rally Australia. A lot of motorsport events will be impacted. A lot of the national sporting leagues will be impacted. And it sets a precedent because there are individual players in the NRL and AFL who are not vaccinated for a variety of reasons. Now, that gets interesting, especially when you have a nation made up of different states and territories that have their own devolved healthcare systems, where the powers of the local state is in charge of certain parts of the healthcare system. It gets interesting. Now, this poses headaches for the AFL, the NRL, the A-League, poses headaches for them because different states have different quarantine rules. And as we found with the AFL and NRL, last year, players and their families were quarantined in Queensland and games were cancelled and rearranged. Now, no games were actually completely wiped off the slate. Every NRL and AFL game got played, but there were changes to the rules, and players basically moved up to Queensland for the NRL for the second half of the season, and their families, in some cases, moved with them. Now, this was all done in a very short space of time. Now, people go, oh, they're professional athletes. They get paid a lot of money. Now, what are they complaining about? Some of them have wives, girlfriends who are heavily pregnant or with young children, and other players may still live with their parents or grandparents, and they may be vulnerable. So there was a bit of consternation with the quarantine rules. Again, it made the Queensland government look pretty bad, to be fair. So state governments as well have been under pressure in Australia for the handling of certain things. Now, it didn't help that certain NRL players didn't behave, and that makes headlines. However, I would say the rushed quarantine job, because there was a lot of negative feedback about how they dealt with the quarantine situation in the state of Victoria. Wasn't a good look. So there was mixed feelings over certain things in regards to how the Queensland state government handled things. And now we're having the same questions about the Melbourne state government and the federal government handling things in the Novak Djokovic case. And I think it sets a precedent because we're all already having discussions about the NRL restrictions on players for this coming season, vaccination status. And while that would normally be a sporting video on the main channel, it is a political discussion. Now, I have a lot of subscribers and viewers on the main channel, all from Australia, and it does get quite interesting. And the same, I think, is having an impact on the European football transfer market. Quarantine rules. It's for me this time of the year. There's always some really big footballing transfers, big amounts of money getting thrown around. Hasn't really been the case. This January, seeming a little bit subdued, although I do expect the next week or so it to ramp up towards the end of the month, but we'll see. But it's been a very, very quiet transfer window, in my personal opinion, in European football. That's not to say that the next week it doesn't explode, but I do think the pandemic is definitely having an impact on the football transfer market. Talking of football, safe standing is being tried out in the Championship and the Premier League because that's something that's been on the discussion point. Obviously, up post Hillsborough, standing was forbidden in the top two divisions of English football, and that's something that has raised on the political agenda. However, talking about politics in the UK, how long has Boris Johnson got, and how has he not resigned or survived to this point? Better way to look at it. He's been in charge now for just over 2 years, 2.5 years. He's been Prime Minister. How the hell is he still in a job? I honestly believe that the handling of the pandemic has been shambolic from about, I would say, 5-6 weeks into the first lockdown. I believe it was shambolic before then, but honestly, we are looking at a very shambolic handling of the quarantines, the lockdowns, the tier system. What the hell was that all about? But it's not helped by the devolved governments of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland having their own health rules as well. There is no national guidance on this because stupidly the Labour government under Tony Blair decided to give devolved powers to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland when it came to healthcare services. So it's become a bit of a shambles, quite frankly, over the last two years, just under 2 years. But in reality, this time 2 years ago, we should have stopped international air travel by this point, and I believe the virus would have been more controlled. We weren't the only country to leave it late. Most of the Western world left it ridiculously late. The US is shambolic. It's the amount of people who believe this is still a hoax or a made up thing. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. As someone who's had it and has had relatives had it, I can tell you now it's far from a hoax. Some people may find it's no more than just a cold, or I've got a bit of a sore back today. Other people, it's killed them. So, quite frankly, anyone who believes that this pandemic is a hoax or is a conspiracy it's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But the in regards to what's come out about the lockdown parties and the breach of lockdown rules and how Boris Johnson is still Prime Minister is absolutely unfathomable to me. Absolutely unfathomable. But it sums up the state of British politics for the last 5-6 years. Quite literally stuck in a state of paralysis would be the best way to describe British politics right now. It is stuck in a state of paralysis. What has happened is the Conservative Party has been taken over by a populist right-wing element. The Labour Party has been taken over by God knows what. I'm gonna say those who want to use divisive identity politics to divide people, but blame the governing Conservative Party for the division that they're playing, and the Liberal Democrats are still trying to, rejoin the human race after Nick Clegg, basically was a bit of a melt. And so, therefore, even though the Liberal Democrats probably are the party everyone should really vote for, they're and they're winning local by-elections, but they on a national level, they're still trying to rebuild the confidence with a lot of dissatisfied voters who went the other way or have just stopped voting in general. But what is interesting is the lack of a credible alternative right now. It's kind of troubling, quite frankly, that this government hasn't had a vote of no confidence in the government's handling of a lot of things, and how they're still there. Quite frankly, it's ridiculous. There are very few of them in there that I believe are actually capable of doing the job. And people voted for them 2 years ago. What were we smoking as a country? Jesus. But the British political scene has been in a state of paralysis since the 6 months leading up to the Brexit vote, or the referendum, of which we've had many over the last 12 years, many referendi. You cannot go around making national policy on the basis of multiple referendums. And that seems to be what the British Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, seems what they've been doing for the best part of 12 years. Is we've had the AV referendum, which was no one really gave a toss about that. We've had the Scottish independence referendum. Scotland gave a piss about that, but the rest of the country should have had a say because it's the rest of the union weren't allowed. So that was a flawed logic. And then we had the Brexit referendum. For some reason, the politicians north of the border and nationwide have gone, you know what? We'll make policy by referendi on issues that have some importance. I honestly believe, yes. I think how we cast our votes is important. Electoral reform is always important. The national identity and the future of the country, yes, but referendums are meant to be advisory only. To therefore make policy off the back of referendum results is generally terrifying. Not good. However, if we were to have an AV referendum or a vote electoral reform referendum today, I think A, more people would vote, and B, more people would vote in favour of reforming the electoral system. So that is interesting to note. Very, very interesting to note. However, the state of paralysis we are in troubles me, quite frankly, quite a bit. There has been no direction in economic policy. Foreign policy has become a mess, especially with the continent of Europe. Various domestic issues haven't been addressed on a variety of serious and important issues. Very little movement in social reform. There's issues all over the place when it comes to domestic policy, because since 2016 and that referendum result, we've had 3 prime ministers, and they've been getting progressively worse. That's what's generally terrifying. We've had a couple of general elections. We've had no real progress, I believe, on a lot of domestic social issues and domestic policy. And yeah, there's a paralysis. There's a paralysis of decision making. There's a paralysis in there's just a paralysis and a polarization of the voting public, the political spectrum, very polarized. The trouble is, the guy in charge, he's not really a Brexiteer. He's not really a Remainer. He's an opportunist. He worked out from looking at grassroots Conservative members, that there was a slight majority in favour of leaving the European Union, and therefore that was his gateway to get to number 10. Quite honestly, if there'd been a slight majority in favour of staying, he would have backed the Remain campaign. More likely than not. However, he still wanted to get number 10, so the best way to do that was to oppose the current Prime Minister at the time, who was David Cameron. And that was his gateway. He definitely used various means to get number 10. He was a backbencher when the referendum was called. He then became a government minister. It was crap at that, which should have been a warning sign to the country. This guy is not fit to lead the country. Then there was allegations about his time as London mayor. And finally, we end up with various scandals, which, if this was going back 25 years, John Major, that's why his government lost the 97 election, was not because of what John Major did, but because some of his party members did, which have, caused the collapse of the Conservative government. Quite literally, it was collapsing right before the general election, and it collapsed after the general election and was replaced by Labour in a landslide defeat. Funny thing is that that's the best polling result Labour's ever had until the last two elections. Quite literally. And also the worst electoral defeat the Labour Party's had in modern British history. So what's happened is British politics has gone a bit more to the right, but it's still, by American standards, suspiciously communist and left-wing, because we still have a national health service and national insurance and pensions and state education and a whole host of other things that the Americans don't have. But apparently we're still commie bastards to the Americans when it comes to our European politics, which is really interesting. So if our Conservative Party are right wing, God knows what the Democrats are in the US. We haven't even got started on the US mess that is Joe Biden and Trump and co. Their politics is even more paralysed than ours. We'll get to that if questions arise. But how Boris Johnson is still Prime Minister, I'm scratching my head. There is growing discontent within his own party. And I do believe the on the ground party members, those who go canvassing and, party members at local level have lost faith in the system. They've definitely lost faith in their boss, who is Boris Johnson, and there is growing bleeding to the other two major parties, National, which is the Lib Dems, and Labour, with several horrific by-election defeats in safe areas, which is also not good. You expect a government of the day, if there's a by-election, to not be very, very popular in certain parts, but Jesus Christ, there's that one in Shropshire where they've always had the seat, always had a Conservative council in the area, always brought back a Conservative, or originally a Tory MP back in the day, and it's gone to the Lib Dems by a massive, massive swing. Repeat that on a national level. However, the Labour Party has its own problems, massive problems at that. 3 million of its core voters switched to other parties at the last election 2 and a bit years ago. I don't think it's won them all back, and that weakens them as a credible opposition when they've had 3 million of their voter base desert them, either to join the Lib Dems or join the Conservatives or other right-wing parties. It does show a massive disconnect between the government, the Labour elite in London, and the electorate in various areas around the country, especially in the Midlands and the North, where you would expect the Labour Party to do quite well. They didn't. They got hammered badly, which tells you a lot. When the working class voter is deserting the party of the working class, tells you a hell of a lot about the situation. The same could be said for France as well. Some more extreme populist candidates are gaining a lot of momentum, and we're not even sure if President Macron is going to stand in their coming election. Angela Merkel's party, well, they haven't got a replacement chancellor yet, so she's still in the Reichstag, Bundestag, or whatever you want to call it. She's still in the chancellery in Germany, but as a caretaker. And there are big divisions within German politics as well. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what happens in Berlin. Same in Holland. They technically have a caretaker government. They haven't formed a new government as things stand. Their election was last year, quite some time ago. So the Ritter caretaker government is in place, but they've had issues. There's a lot of social unrest across Europe in the last 12 months in regards to bringing in mandatory vaccination policies, which have not gone down well, various different lockdowns, different COVID type passes, basically restricting civil liberties more than what was expected 2 years ago. A lot of people were promised that this wouldn't happen, and they've gone ahead and done it. Now, there's a lot of countries facing elections, be it regional or national elections, across Europe in the coming next year or so. It will be very, very telling how the voting public across Europe respond to what has basically been a shambles for the last 2 years. There's a lot of governments and a lot of political systems that are not very popular right now. And yeah, we could see a massive shift. We could see a big protest vote. So we could see a lot of voters basically putting in a protest vote. And of course, on the backdrop of all this, there's growing tension on the borders of Ukraine with Russia and Ukraine. And we could see further conflict in eastern Ukraine, or a full-out invasion of Ukraine proper by the Kremlin. So there are ongoing talks between the US and the Russians. And of course, in Europe, you've got two more nuclear states than us and the French, and we're members of NATO. And a big debate is whether Ukraine joins NATO or not. Big tensions are in Eastern Europe, which could spill over into quite rapidly. There's a large amount of military build up on Russia's western border with Ukraine, which is Ukraine's eastern border, and there's still been a low level conflict around the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine that's been simmering for several years now. So there is growing concern that there's going to be a military clash in Eastern Europe on the backdrop of this COVID pandemic. So there's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And we'll have to see how that all takes place. But troubling times when you've got 4 nuclear states, 3 of them on one side and 1 on the other, basically pointing missiles at each other. It's like a return to the Cold War 30, 40 years ago in the 80s with Reagan and Gorby. And basically the US won the Cold War by outspending and strangling the Soviet economy until it collapsed. But there was a backdrop with a conflict in Afghanistan, which the Soviets were put down at the time. Fast forward 35 years, we've learned nothing, I believe, from the generation before. We are repeating the same mistakes that have led to other major conflicts for time immemorial. We have learned nothing, absolutely nothing, which shouldn't be the case. So there is growing tension across Europe socially, and there's a major military build-up just on the borders of Ukraine. But Ukraine's been a bit of a flashpoint since early 2014. It's been a flashpoint, if not before then. with the Maidan protests and the change of government, and then what happened with the Crimea takeover and the conflict in the east of Ukraine. There's been tension there for the best part of a decade, but it's really ramping up now with the amount of military personnel both sides of the Ukrainian border basically ramping up, and also across the edge of the EU, like Finland all the way down to Romania. Um, Major ramp up of military personnel and military movement, um, which is very, very concerning. So there's that to bear in mind, as we go further into 2022. Could we see an armed conflict between East and West of the likes we have not seen since, I'm going to say, the Yugoslav wars? I think living memory, but the flashpoints we've had in the past in Budapest and Prague in the 50s and 60s during the Cold War. We could see the world edge closer to a nuclear conflict for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. And then you've got issues further afield in places like India, China, and Pakistan, in the Kashmir region and the Punjab region. Three nuclear states aiming missiles at each other. That's kind of troubling as well. The situation in Hong Kong, quite troubling. But Macau, the other former European colony in China, former Portuguese colony, no such tensions there. So that's really interesting why Hong Kong has become a flashpoint, whereas Macau further up the coast hasn't. That's really, really interesting how that's playing out. And of course, you've got the backdrop to the Beijing Winter Olympics, where there's been a diplomatic boycott by a lot of countries, and a lot of athletes are also calling for boycotts of that Olympics, plus the backdrop of the COVID pandemic and other such issues. That makes for very interesting reading, and what people can take out of that is anyone's guess. But it does create a lot of interesting talking points, and that's a wait and see kind of thing. I wouldn't be surprised if more athletes pull out for various reasons. And I do believe the COVID pandemic is definitely one of them. And it'd be interesting to see if there's further political, diplomatic boycotts of the Olympics in Beijing. Partly a sporting story, partly a political and social backdrop to that. But the Tokyo Olympics was beset by, obviously, the COVID backdrop, delayed by a year, no fans in attendance. There were athletes pulling out. There were athletes tested positive. Not the most memorable Olympic Games. So it'd be interesting to see how this Winter Olympics compares to last year's Summer Olympics. And, it does raise a lot of questions. There's been other sporting events that have become very politicised as well. The Euros became heavily political. There's been issues, obviously, the Rugby League World Cup being delayed by a year. The British government's pumped money into that tournament, and delaying it by a year has definitely impacted the prospective revenues that tournament can bring, and what the government gets back in return. There's been a lot of government spending in regards to that. It hasn't necessarily become the political hot potato, let's say, if it was a football World Cup or Euros, but the British Minister for Sport, whose name passes me by because he's not that important, is saying we shouldn't bid for the World Cup in 2030. We should bid for the Euros in 2028. We have more chance of winning. So that's interesting in itself. So there's a lot floating on in the background, in regards to some of these big sporting events that have big political ramifications. And there's a lot of geopolitics being played out in certain parts of the world. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, quite frankly. And it's a watch this kind of space. So let's have a look at see some of the breaking news headlines, both nationally and internationally. Let's get off that. Let's have a look. See, here we go. So I'm going by news in the UK and some of the big news stories that are occurring right now. There's a call to delay compulsory vaccines for NHS staff. That's been a very political hot potato in recent weeks. There's a senior Conservative member of Parliament who's discussing blackmail claims with the police. The UK is being urged to do more to support the Ukrainian government in regards to the rising tensions in Eastern Europe. But there's not really a lot happening domestically. Really, it's been quite quiet. Obviously, we lost Meatloaf, the singer Meatloaf, died this week. Kamala Harris is in the news. Kamala Harris assumed office in historic fashion, becoming the first woman to serve as Vice President of the United States. But her first year as Vice President has been far from a smooth ride. She's got very low approval ratings. There's been high-profile resignations within her office. Her public approval rating is as low as 28%. So that's lower than Dick Cheney, and he was pretty unpopular. Wow. So yeah, Kamala Harris is facing historically low approval ratings as Vice President. There's an article here about why the Beijing Winter Olympics and why they're so controversial. The Beijing Winter Olympics and Paralympics are due to take place next month. There may be, obviously delays to that. However, China's human rights record has prompted a number of countries to declare diplomatic boycotts of the games, which means their top officials, such as prime ministers, diplomats, heads of state, will not attend. So they start on the 4th of Feb until the 20th, and we've got about 3,000 athletes competing in 109 events. And the Paralympics do so a month later with less events and less competitors, but it's a parallel competition. China's government and businesses are spending about $4 billion on the games. Indoor ice events will take place in Beijing. Yanqing, which is 75 kilometers away, will stage skiing, bobsleighs, and luge. And Zhang, oh god, a place I can't even pronounce. And then there's further snowboarding events taking place and skiing events about 180 kilometers from Beijing. Oh god, this is how ridiculous awarding the Olympics to Beijing, Winter Olympics, was. A 1.2 million cubic meters of artificial snow will be sprayed onto areas because not enough snow falls there in the region that they're hosting the games in. Couldn't make that up, could you? They've been criticised over the environmental impact of this process. Because of the pandemic, officials and competitors will be kept in secure bubbles, and no spectator tickets will be sold to the public. So it's going to have no fans, much like the Tokyo Games. Which countries have declared diplomatic boycotts? So far, it's Canada, the US, UK, Australia, Lithuania, and Kosovo. Although they will send athletes to compete, no ministers or officials will attend. The US said this was because of China's human rights abuses and atrocities in Xinjiang, against the Uyghur population. British MP Enoch Smith, who represents the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, said the Chinese government commits industrial-scale human rights abuses in the Uyghur region, Tibet, and sends near-daily military incursions into Taiwan's airspace. We cannot lend any legitimacy to China's despotic regime. Japan has also said it won't send any ministers to the Games, although it has stopped short of declaring a diplomatic boycott. The move is still like to heighten tensions between China and Japan. They're not big friends historically. The EU is trying to agree a common diplomatic stance. France is against a boycott, with President Macron saying, I don't think we should politicise these topics, especially to take steps that are insignificant and symbolic. And human rights activists are protesting all over the world. The Beijing government is accused of committing atrocities against the Uyghur Muslim population in Xinjiang. Human rights groups believe that more than 1 million Uyghurs have been detained over the past few years in a large network of what the state calls re-education camps, with hundreds of thousands sentenced to prison terms. There's also evidence that Uyghurs are being used as forced labour and that women are forcibly sterilised. Some former camp detainees allege that they were tortured and sexually abused. Beijing is also accused of restricting the freedom of people in Hong Kong through new legislation, including the Hong Kong National Security Law. In 2021, annual report, Human Rights Watch said that Beijing's repression insisting on political loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party deepened across the country. German government ministers boycotted the Games, said they were protesting against the treatment of Chinese tennis champion Peng Shuai. She was not heard from for nearly 3 weeks after she made allegations of assault against her former vice premier of China and a high-ranking Communist Party member. Ms. Peng, they said they had a romantic relationship and that he had forced her to have sexual relations with him. It's the first time such an allegation has been made against one of China's senior political leaders. China's government denies all the allegations made in the case of the tennis player Peng. The country has also consistently denied violating human rights in Xinjiang and has warned its most vocal accusers, such as the US and Germany, not to interfere in its internal affairs in Hong Kong. It has spoken out most loudly against the US diplomatic boycott. China's foreign ministry said that the US had clearly violated the Olympic spirit and will pay a price for its erroneous actions. However, it is not specified what that price may be. Oh dear. So the diplomatic boycott and some of the language being used is probably not helpful. Oh God. Not a lot going on, really. European Champions countries. Let's have a look at sport, because sport obviously is interesting. Man City are still losing to Southampton, which is good because Man City are a team you've got to love to hate. So yes, there is all sorts going on. But yes, but you're not really. Oh dear. So talking about COVID pandemic, Africa Cup of Nations giant killers Comoros face a goalkeeping crisis before their country's biggest game ever on Monday against Cameroon. They play the hosts and 5-time champions Cameroon, but their camp has been hit by 12 positive cases, including the head coach, 7 players, 2 remaining fit goalkeepers. Oh God! So that could be interesting. So yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, the Olympics in China, I think will always be a very hot topic until it takes place. We've seen Olympic boycotts before. The LA and Moscow Olympics in 80 and 84 had boycotts. All that did was affect the medal tables. I wouldn't necessarily say that overall that it really, in my opinion, affected the overall product, apart from some of the best athletes weren't necessarily available at the time to compete. I think that might have been the only subplot to it. As far as we know, no nations are openly boycotting by not sending their athletes, although individual athletes, I think, themselves are willing to pull out and not attend. Um, so we'll see what happens with the Beijing Olympics, but there's a political backdrop to it, um, and I think it will be interesting to see how it all uh, plays out. Um, but yeah, the Beijing Olympics, a lot of political capital has been put on this, much like the Tokyo Olympics, and no fans in attendance. I mean, that's really interesting that no fans are allowed to buy tickets. Will other countries join the political boycott? We'll have to wait and see. Personally, because that also in itself will be really interesting to see if uh, other nations decide to join the diplomatic boycott. The fact that several high-profile nations globally, such as Canada, the US, and Australia, and the UK, have decided to diplomatically boycott is very, very striking. But we haven't reached the point where a nation refuses to send its athletes. So with the Moscow Olympics in 1980 and the LA 84 Olympic Games, where the Soviet Union and the US went tit for tat and refused to attend, we haven't got to that level yet. And that to me is slightly surprising. The diplomatic boycott, I don't think it achieves much. It's a bit of diplomatic PR, really. It's a bit of showboating or saber rattling. It doesn't really achieve much, I don't think. And what the final medal tell, I mean, I don't. Individual athletes have come out and been very, very critical of what's happening domestically and overseas with China. But hey, look, our human rights abuses have been solved because an athlete's had a little word. I mean, I call it champagne socialism. What I find funny is several major high-profile sports leagues have been willing to take pre-season and exhibition games such as the NBA, the NHL, European football to China in the last God knows however many years. They're willing to make money off the Chinese market. There's Chinese money in European football. There's Chinese money in the NBA, in the NHL. They buy a lot of the product. So I find it highly hypocritical that these leagues, these organisations have got individuals saying boycott the games. But in actual fact, the NHL pulled out because of the COVID restrictions. You've got NBA basketball players who are more than happy to take pre-season games there and take the money, but now saying we have to boycott the Olympics. It in my opinion, it doesn't solve the problems that are there. And in the past, all it's done is altered the medal table. Of course, you want to see the best athletes. If you love your winter sports, which I do, I'm a bit disappointed that the NHL players aren't at the Winter Olympics and the ice hockey competition. I am, because I was looking forward to see the best players play, their countries. Now that isn't the case. So yes, that is very, very disappointing. In regards to high-profile athletes coming out and speaking, okay, if the best talent is not going to go, fine. But there was no complaints about the last Beijing Olympics in 2008. I seem to remember all those years ago. The athletes were more than happy to go 14 years ago to the Summer Olympics in Beijing. Um, and China was still doing the same things 14 years ago that it's doing now. So you got to have it both ways. And it's the same with Russia as well. They've had the World Cup, they've had the Sochi Winter Olympics. And with the backdrop of that, we found out about the state-sponsored doping program. But that's nothing new. Countries have been doing that for 40 years. The East Germans were very, very good at it. Um, and quite frankly, in my opinion, to me, that in itself. But it's like they're awarding the FIFA World Cup to Qatar. They're the corruption behind it. So yeah, sport I think has failed to regulate. Professional sport has failed to regulate itself. I think we can all admit that. There's clearly a lot of state collusion and state involvement of a negative nature. These major tournaments and major sporting events do become politicized, whether we want more to be or not. And absolutely, there's got to come a point where we have the discussion about the politicization and using major sporting events as political tools, soft power, as so to speak, and and that changes the conversation we're having. It does. It does change the conversation we're having. And this Olympics is much like the Qatar World Cup that happens at the end of the year. There's a big debate about boycotting that. And I think the viewership figures globally on TV will play out how they do, and then you can work out how popular the events are. Now, I have to admit, the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics we had 4 years ago wasn't the best Winter Olympics I've ever watched. It wasn't. It wasn't the best Winter Olympics I've ever watched. Um, I make no disguise of that, and it very very similar, I think, to the USA '94 football World Cup and South Africa 2010. Not the best football tournaments I've ever watched. I think the USA '94 was possibly the worst I've ever seen. Um, but that was more on a sporting standpoint. The Qatar Football World Cup and this Winter Olympics, I think there's going to be a bit more than just the sporting aspect to it. We know the backdrop to the Qatar World Cup. We know the corruption at FIFA that awarded them the World Cup. There's been a lot of criticism of awarding the tournament to Qatar originally. A lot of criticism, and um, and that's justified. Whereas the USA does have a sporting heritage, admittedly not in, admittedly more in recent times. Yes, it has got a very strong footballing heritage now. At the time, it really didn't. Um, you can understand the reasons why the USA got that World Cup in '94. This Qatar World Cup, there's been a lot of political debate about it, and there has been fallout from it in the years since the tournament was awarded. There's been criminal investigations. People have gone to prison. The expose of corruption within FIFA and the various regional federations, and then the domestic FAs involved with rigging the vote, bribery, and embezzlement of funds. The human rights record of Qatar very similar to China. A lot of criticism has been aimed that way. Then we had the Saudi-led takeover of Newcastle United, and again, a lot of human rights groups been putting pressure to block the deal, which they tried, they failed. But what I find interesting, there wasn't this uproar when Man City or PSG were bought by Arab owners, again, whose countries have very dubious human rights records in certain areas with women's rights and minority rights. So there is this hypocrisy that we've seen over the last decade and a half, where it's okay for certain nation backs rate, certain you know, people can't, but it does show the politicization of sport as a tool, um, and there is a lot of criticism thrown around um, in on the street on social media. Um, so yeah, we'll see what happens in that regard. Other political news: mandatory vaccines and COVID passports and COVID passes, as I say, across Europe. That's created a lot of pushback from the population. There's a lot of frustration um, with border shutdowns and heavy restrictions, and then basically singling out the unvaccinated for a variety of reasons, social stigma attached to it, um, legislation being brought in to try and make vaccinations compulsory, um, you know, and that is a very difficult subject to debate about, both here in the UK and further afield across Europe. Um, some countries got really low vaccine uptake, other countries have got very high vaccine uptake. And what the UK is planning to do is, especially in England, is to remove restrictions by as early as next week, which I think is ridiculous. Quite frankly, this time last year we were in basically another full lockdown. Um, with my day job, it didn't overly affect me. I was still going to work. I've worked solidly doing my job in the sanitation kind of industry, waste collection, um, solidly for 2 years through this pandemic. I'm on my third job in the pandemic as well. I've moved twice. So for me, I've got on with my day-to-day life. What I've seen is there's been some shortages. Uh, there's been some shortages. Certain items have become more expensive, um, but overall it hasn't overly impacted me. Um, I'm actually paid better now than what I was at the start. Uh, I think what's affected me is more the mental health side of things, and the social side of things to a point. Um, but overall, my life hasn't been overly affected. I just got on with life. I've got used to wearing a mask in shops. I've got used to wearing a mask on public transport. Um, that doesn't overly bother me. Um, but going out for a walk, I was doing that anyway. Um, YouTube, doing that anyway. I think what affected me the most was the lack of sporting content for the main channel. So yeah, there was a lot of lack of things to talk about at times. I took a bit of a break from social media in a certain extent, and then this time last year, I was building up to the new NRL season. The English football was being beset by postponements and cancellations. Fast forward a year, the same thing has happened. You know, I haven't been to the cinema in over 2 years. I haven't been to a sporting event in over 2 years. I've been to the pub 3, 4 times in the last year or so. So certain things I've changed, but I wouldn't overly say it's impacted me day to day. In a positive, I basically stopped drinking, um, which is what I was doing a lot of before the pandemic and during the early phases of the pandemic. I was drinking a lot, and then I decided to knock it on the head and go, I don't miss it. Um, you know, I don't do it anymore. Um, so for me, that's no big loss really. Things that I have noticed more difficult, hospital waiting times have gone up. I've had to go to hospital a few times, and you're waiting in A&E for 4, 5, 6 hours. Getting doctor's appointments has become near impossible. You know, there has been certain things I've noticed that have become a bit more difficult. But all told, I wouldn't say it's overly impacted me massively. I can go to work every day, um, do the job, go home. That hasn't been overly, I don't think, uh, overly has impacted me. Um, if I'm being honest, um, I wouldn't say that. Uh, I just think, yeah, that I haven't been overly. What's my phone doing? I haven't been, um, yeah, overly impacted, so to speak, in regards to my day-to-day life. What I have found the most difficult, though, in regards to the pandemic and changes, is the lack of being able to see um, friends and family at times. I think has had an impact, and I think has definitely been the most difficult. And I've had some mental health struggles, but at the same time, you know, I live by myself anyway, so that I suppose is the toughest thing about the last 2 years is seeing your friends less, um, and that little bit of, as I say, living by myself. Um, I think it has affected the mental side of things. It definitely impacted on my relationship with my ex partner, because I got so used to living by myself. Actually, having someone else around was a bit difficult, which hasn't been pleasant. But I think mental health services has definitely been massively impacted. More people are having been forced to use them. There's definitely been a rise in suicide, which is something that's been noted in the statistics. Um, so there's going to be a long-term effect when we get out of the pandemic into when it becomes endemic again, and when we get back to some kind of normality, and things open up fully, and we get to some kind of normal, pre-pandemic normal. There's definitely a backlog with mental health services. There's definitely a backlog with uh, normal medical services, not other than COVID related ones. There's a backlog there. There's a huge waiting list for operations. There's a huge waiting list in the court system. So there's a backlog in the legal systems for pending trials, and legal process. Um, a lot of prisoners were released early under COVID grounds. A lot of prisoners got early release. So you've got people who've been outside of society being pumped back into mainstream society, and then suddenly they're, you know, thrown out under the bus. There's been difficulties with uh, housing, rental issues, and people having difficulty paying rent, paying bills. The furlough schemes, depending where you are, and the stimulus checks, but depending where you are, vary from country to country. Some countries have been very, very generous, other countries not so much. Um, some businesses have gone under completely and gone out, and people have lost their jobs. Other businesses have done very, very well. So economically, it's a very mixed picture. I mean, if you are in a company that deals with, you know, um, the building trade, there's a backlog in getting supplies to builders. So around where I live, there's a lot of building projects, like building sites, and well, they haven't finished, and they should have finished, and they're behind schedule. And there's been a shortage of building supplies. Small building firms, you know, small building firms, independents, they've gone under. Some bigger firms that got government contracts are struggling to complete on time. So the construction industry is being affected in a negative way. Um, Car sales, car registrations are at their lowest level ever since the 30s, I believe. So new car registrations. There's been issues in car production as well. So vehicle production has been affected. Shipping has been affected. Um, so there's been a whole host of issues in regards to the movement of goods and services. But then again, other businesses have done very, very well. Um, you know, it's a difficult one to put out, but some businesses have actually done very, very well. It's bizarre. Like some of the internet providers and telecommunications companies have made a massive, massive, massive profits. Um, some of the streaming companies, so things like Netflix, Disney Plus, um, massive, massive profits because people have been stuck at home. Uh, People have been working from home, so delivery companies have seen a massive boost in trade. So couriers, people have been working from home, they need things delivered. So be it things for their job or personal items, so your vanity purchase buys, definitely seen a massive boost. So delivery companies and companies that do online sales only, like Amazon and Play.com, massive surge in their sales. Other companies have had difficulties getting their products on shelves. So the availability of PlayStations, the new PlayStation 5, very hard to get your hands on them. Very, very hard. Um, and I always look on social media with the potential purchase of Activision by Microsoft, which should, I think, ultimately boost sales of the latest Xbox. A lot of people have been, saying that, well, it would be nice to get our hands on PlayStation. And Sony are on the back foot. And should this push Sony into purchasing other game developers so they can continue to have their own console-only titles? And people have been saying, well, it would be nice to actually get hold of the latest Sony PlayStation 5. Xbox is starting to win the battle of the console wars, which have been going on since the 70s and 80s with the early Ataris and such. So Microsoft is taking a very big risk with the Activision acquisition should it be able to pass through the regulators. Um, as I was saying earlier, Activision has had a lot of negative headlines in regards to ongoing lawsuits, harassment claims, bullying claims, poor work environment. It's also had a lot of negative headlines about the products it's been producing in recent years. The last 5, 6 years, the quality, I honestly believe, of the products that Activision's puts out there has definitely declined and gone downhill. I follow a lot of gamers on social media, and they've been very, very critical of the direction that Activision has been taking. Um, and the potential purchase by Microsoft is very, very interesting because Microsoft, as I say, as a company, has been, well, punished by regulators at various points for breaching monopoly rules and they're breaching certain rules. So back in the day, Microsoft Word and Microsoft Office was free on all Windows devices. Now you have to pay for it. So they had fallen foul of the regulators before. So it'd be very, very interesting to see if this fully goes ahead or if they do purchase Activision Blizzard, whether they have to split up the company that they're buying and siphon off bits to remain independent of the Microsoft gaming arm, which is Xbox. So that creates a whole backdrop economically, but Microsoft has the money to buy Activision. So that'll be interesting. On a gaming standpoint, we're waiting for any point on a release date for GTA 6. We've been waiting for the best part of a decade for a sequel to GTA 5. And again, a lot of people are saying we've had enough of the microtransactions within the game. A lot of people, for some reason, survived 3 generations of gaming platform, but a lot of people are getting bored and frustrated, and some people have given up that there is going to be a GTA 6 ever. And a lot of people in the gaming community are kind of frustrated with a lot of the releases that have come out since the release of the new Xbox and the new PlayStation. A lot of people are very, very frustrated. There's been a lot of criticism of some of the releases. Cyberpunk was, well, terrible, quite frankly. The re-release of the GTA original trilogy, GTA 3, San Andreas and Vice City, again, heavily criticised for the rushed redevelopment of that part of the gaming franchise. And quite frankly, the lack of finished product. A lot of games are coming out unfinished, laced with microtransactions, laced with extra downloadable content that is frustrating, which actually makes the game worse, makes the final product worse. The latest Battlefield installment from EA Games has been roundly criticised and has gone free to play. EA have made a massive loss on it. It came out. It was the build up, much fanfare, a lot of publicity, and within weeks of it coming out, they've already turned it to a free to play download. It's gone down really badly. But I've noticed this, and this is why I haven't turned the Xbox on for a year and a half. I have noticed a decline in the finished product quality of games. I prefer some of the older titles and earlier titles that were on release 5, 10, 15 years ago. I still play games on my original PlayStation that are 20 years old. I have noticed a decline in the final product that we as the consumer get at the end of the day, and the cost, the actual purchasing price, whether you buy it on GameStore or you buy the hard copy by disc, has skyrocketed. And the final product is just not good enough. They're laced with bugs. They crash constantly. They fail to meet the expectations that for the amount of money we are paying for the consoles and the games themselves, we expect of the finished product. And quite honestly, the gaming industry is under a lot of pressure. And there's been a lot of negative headlines coming out about the gaming industry in recent years of work practices, issues with some really bad work environments. A lot of scandals come out about a lot of developers, and it's led to the point where Microsoft's about to buy Activision. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, time will tell. I think it might be a good thing. I think Microsoft will clear out a lot of the toxicity within the Activision company. There's been a very toxic work environment at Activision for quite some time, and that's borne out in the products that they are producing, and the criticism that they've had from us, the consumer, saying this is not good enough. The amount of money you are expecting us as your consumers to spend on inferior product from what it was 10 years ago when you were releasing products. The quality has gone downhill, the price has gone uphill. So there's been a lot of criticism aimed at some of these companies. Right, so that's me ranting for an hour and 20 minutes. Good at that. But there's a lot of things to discuss. And on the sports channel, I always have a lot of things to discuss. And there's always a lot of topics to discuss. And what I'm finding more and more often is the sports side of things is merging with the political side of things more and more. And I try and keep the politics off the main channel. And it is getting harder and harder to do. Each week it is getting harder and harder to separate the politics from the sport. And that worries me long term, that professional sport is becoming politicized to such a degree that it's actually becoming less enjoyable to watch. With this political interference and political just mess that's definitely had an impact on viewing sport and watching sport as an escape from everyday worries. It's starting to not do that. So that's an interesting subplot to watch, and you will see how it all plays out in the end. But yeah, I was hoping this would be a live stream where I answer loads of questions, but instead it's just me discussing a lot of topics of the day and my views on it. On the regards to Boris Johnson and his future, I'm surprised he's still Prime Minister. The issue is who is going to replace him. If we have a general election tomorrow, would you vote for the Labour Party? Would you vote for the Liberal Democrats? Would you vote Sir Keir Starmer or Sir Ed Davey into office? That's what's generally troubling. Would you see one of them as prime ministerial material? The answer is no. And if Boris Johnson does resign, who would you get to replace him? Because I have very little, if no faith, in any of the Conservative front bench. And so therefore we have no one else. That's the problem. There is no one else, I think, with the force of will and personality, let alone the policies that they would put forward in a manifesto to really entice people to want to vote. So the state of British politics right now is an absolute shambles. But as I say, for the last 6-7 years, we've had political paralysis. There has been paralysis since the referendum was in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2015. David Cameron won his majority. There has been nothing short of political paralysis since the announcement of a referendum date and the campaigning in the build-up to that said referendum date. There has been nothing short of political paralysis. And in the last 12 years, we've had 3 referendums, and we have then therefore based government policy of at least 2 of them, which is worrying because they're meant to be advisory. And people can judge David Cameron on the fact that he's a Conservative Prime Minister. I do think he did a half decent job. He's not the worst Prime Minister we've had, but this current Prime Minister we have had, yeah, no, I think he's possibly one of the worst, if not the worst, Prime Minister we have had since Neville Chamberlain or Bonar Law of the 30s, 40s. We are going back 90 years to find an equally shocking Prime Minister, which tells you all you need to know. Maybe Callaghan in the late 70s. He wasn't great either because of the winter of discontent and the handling of the said economic crisis in the late 70s. But Jesus, I wouldn't even compare them as incompetent as this current Prime Minister. Like we're talking since people were alive when Bonar Law and Chamberlain were prime ministers. In the late 30s and into 1940, people were alive in this country. The Queen being one of them. I don't even think Boris Johnson is even half as decent as they were, and they were pretty hopeless, quite frankly. We've got a new level of low here. So, God knows. I mean, Theresa May, I think, was just not helped by her party, but Boris Johnson, we are reaching new levels of incompetence that I don't think we have ever seen. But I do think that the opposition parties, they're not much better, quite frankly, in regards to giving a viable option or alternative to what we currently have. So make of that what you will. I generally don't think right now. We've had a state of paralysis, but we also have no real options because there's no one at a national level, I think, who has got, I shouldn't say it, the personality and also the convictions behind them and the policies behind them and the policy think tanks that are going to take this country forward. Because the Labour Party has agreed that Brexit has happened. We're outside the EU. The Lib Dems, I think, have accepted that the best we can hope for is a renegotiation of any kind of future relationship we have with the European Union. But I don't think they're going to even be brave enough to go, we will re-enter the Union, because that would be electoral suicide, simply because of the divided electorate. So I don't know where we go from here. I generally don't. And Therefore, I'm really at a loss as to where the country goes from here, because we've had political paralysis, a lack of decent legislation, a lot of domestic issues that have not been resolved at all, um, and the damage done by this 2-year period, we are going to feel for decades to come. And it's not just in the UK. I think that's across the world. I think the damage done in this 2-year period, by mismanaging the pandemic, some of the decisions taken, um, we're going to feel the effects of this for years to come. But we may be coming out of this pandemic, but the economic and social impacts are going to be with us for 10, 20 years. It's just how it is. But the political paralysis we have and the lack of legislation in regards to a lot of domestic issues that various countries are facing is kind of worrying. And some of the policies that have been put in place during this period, it's very easy to put a policy in place. It's very, very hard to undo it. So bear that in mind. And I thank you very much for watching. If you have watched at all, and if you rewatch this in full and leave some comments below, I'll be very interested to see what you guys have to say. But there will be some more videos on this channel coming very, very soon. And if there's any heavy snow, I might put some weather videos up, because my weather videos tend to do quite well on the channel. So if we have any ridiculous weather, so snow or hail or anything like that, keep your eyes peeled for some weather videos, because I do believe we are going to have snow before the end of winter, beginning of spring. I do believe that to be the case. It's cold enough. This cold air has sat over the UK now for a couple of weeks. So if and when we get a severe enough weather front coming in from a northerly direction, I think we'll have snow rather than rain or sleet. I think it will definitely be cold enough. Not just in the Northern Islands of Scotland. I don't know. We're talking. I think we could see snowfall further south. So there is that. But thank you very much for watching if you have been. And of course, I look forward to seeing what comments are left on this video after it's published. But thank you very much for watching. I'll see you soon. Oh, no, end stream. Go, stupid laptop.